In Trumbull County, we have Bruce Valley Creek, and that is going to get started sometime in May. And so, barring any major COVID issues, we should have some exciting stuff showing up here come next fall. The next thing I would like you to do on our website, there is a menu called Chapter Survey. If you all would just log in someday and answer, there's like 6 or 7 questions. I said 6 or 7. I wrote the questions. I don't know how many I wrote, but there are 6 or 7. So, and we just want to know, what we're doing, what you think we should be doing, what you would like us to do, and what you might want to participate in. And we would appreciate that. Tom has total of 8 segments up. The last one is Kelly, and if you look at Kelly and then you go back a couple of segments and you see her husband Jesse, their husband and wife, and Jesse was teaching his wife how to fly fish, which I have been told that usually ends up in very quiet periods for days, trying to teach them how to do that, but it looked like they did very well. So it's really kind of a cool segment. Matt Wysocki is going to have he's going to have another brushing, and it may be over at Wilson Creek. The boys have done a marvelous job on Duncan Creek the last couple of times, but evidently they did an awful lot of work, and there's a lot of traveling up, going further, deeper down Duncan, and so they might migrate towards Wilson next time around. The one thing that the chapter, we had a meeting last Tuesday, and I asked the board members to give me a notice and officers in March if they want to continue with being on the board or being officers. As some of the terms are up, but this is because of the COVID issues in the last year. We've kind of extended some of the people to take on this year. And so they have till March to tell us if they would like to continue on with those responsibilities. But we do have room for probably 2 or 3 more board members. So if anyone would like to participate in that, that would be great, especially if any of those who have some social media experiences and can actually submit some content, and we'll kind of go from there. Next November, it's November, holy cow, I'm moving. Next February, Hunter Dorn is going to do a demonstration on the HC minnow. So it's going to be kind of like a fly tying night. And if you look on the website and the chapter meetings, you'll see Hunter there, and there's a list of materials. And if you want to tie along with him, that's great. We also record it, so if you want to view it later, that's great. If you missed a couple of those meetings, they're recorded. Just click on the meeting for December and January, and you can view it on our YouTube channel. Okay, I think I've bored you enough now, so I'm going to turn this back over to Tom, and we'll go from there.
All right. So like Jim said, certainly appreciate everybody being here, and especially want to extend a great thanks to Emma Easterly. We have Emma and Kasey, who are Wisconsin DNR Fisheries Biologists, and Emma is down in Jackson County. And Jackson County is one of the counties that our chapter covers. I see on the call Peter and a few others that are pretty familiar with the area down there as well. So we may have Kasey from the DNR as well tonight. We might have some tech issues with getting her linked up. So if we don't have her tonight, we have Emma, and we have full attention to her. But Emma's going to talk a little bit about the Jackson County brook trout streams and cold water resources down there. So we're thinking that Emma's got some slides and content to share, and then after she's done, we'll take questions and discussions on that. And Emma, we'll turn it over to you. And it looks like Kasey might be joining in here in a minute. So I may message with her a little bit while you're presenting, Emma, but we'll turn the mic over to you and we'll make sure that we've all got our mics muted as well.
All right, sounds good. I'm just gonna share my screen here really quick.
You bet.
I'm assuming everyone can see that good?
You bet. Yep, looks great.
Great. Well, with that, I'll get started here. Like Tom said, my name is Emma Easterly. I'm stationed in the Black River Falls office. And I appreciate all of you tuning in tonight on this Thursday evening. I hope everyone has had a good start to the new year so far. I do have double monitors, so I'm probably going to be looking back and forth between both the screens. So hopefully that's not too distracting, but you should be able to see my presentation. So it should be good. Tonight, I'll be talking a little bit about Jackson County coldwater streams. And I'm going to try to keep the talk fairly short, but also informative and to the point. I know from experience, it's kind of hard to stay focused in these online meetings. So with that, I'll dive right in here. So when Jim first asked me to give this talk just back in months ago, his question that he wanted me to answer was basically this. What factors makes Jackson County streams resilient to climate change, and what monitoring and precautions are needed to maintain this resilience? And so there's definitely a lot going on in this question. You know, we could talk about all night about issues such as global warming and climate change, but those are definitely controversial topics these days. But the three main words, or I suppose topics that kind of stuck out to me in this question were resilience, monitoring, and precautions. And so I'm going to kind of dive into each of these topics as they relate to Jackson County coldwater streams this evening. But before I dive into my first topic of resilience, I just wanted to give kind of a brief background about what makes Jackson County maybe a little bit different than other counties in my management area. And that difference that I wanted to point out this evening is this kind of geological division of the county. So hopefully you're able to see this outline of Jackson County, and we see it's divided into the Central Sand Plains region and the Driftless. So in that eastern portion, we have the Central Sands Plains region. And in Wisconsin, that's home to a lot of forested areas and wetlands. And of course, it's got a lot of that irrigated agriculture, lots of cranberries and potatoes in that part of the state. And then in the western portion of Jackson County, we have the Driftless area, sometimes called the Western Coulee Ridges part of Wisconsin. And I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with this area of Wisconsin, these complex patterns of ridges and valleys. You know, they've been cut out by streams over the past several millions of years. And so this kind of geological division of the county, it makes Jackson County unique from, let's say, Trempealeau or Buffalo counties that I also manage. Those counties lie entirely within the Driftless area. So that kind of makes Jackson County unique in that way. And so the first question I like to answer here is, what does this mean in terms of resilience? Kind of, I suppose, how does this sort of geological division of Jackson County make their coldwater streams more resilient to climate change or global warming? And so basically what I want to talk about tonight is the quality and the quantity of groundwater here in the county. And so we know in Wisconsin, groundwater is very important. You know, basically, if a stream isn't groundwater fed, it's probably not a trout stream. You know, we have the cool and maybe warm water streams that might serve as possible refuges during the winter. But basically in the summer, if a stream isn't groundwater fed, it's probably not a trout stream. So this groundwater is extremely important to trout here in the state. And so when I talk about the quality of groundwater, I'm mainly talking about or referring to sort of how clean or how free of contaminants that water is. And an important feature in noting that is the type of bedrock in the county. And so I don't know if this is blurry to you, but it doesn't really matter. The point I want to kind of make with this slide here is you can see that the majority of the Jackson County is this kind of orangish yellow color. And that color corresponds to a sandstone bedrock type. And the type of bedrock is important here because the depth to the bedrock is pretty shallow. So the type of bedrock here really determines how easily a contaminant can reach the groundwater. And so the majority of Jackson County is, as you can see, sandstone, and it offers more protection from this infiltrating water that may contain contaminants. So the further west you go into Trempealeau, southern Trempealeau and into Buffalo counties, that sandstone, it starts to change into more of a limestone and dolomite bedrock. And so those types of bedrock tend to allow water to sort of pass through them a little more quickly, making it harder, making it easier for contaminants to reach the groundwater. So I suppose in short here, the Jackson County bedrock type of sandstone, it makes it harder for contaminants to be transported from that surface of the land into the water table. Secondly here, when I talk about the quantity of groundwater, I'm talking about the rate of recharge. So most of the cold water streams here in Jackson County, they originate in these kind of lower gradient wetland complexes. And typically these wetland complexes, they tend to discourage poor land use practices. And that typically helps groundwater remain on the landscape longer, allowing for a better rate of recharge. So the wetlands, they discourage poor land use practices because they just don't really allow for agriculture or residential development. It's probably also a reason why we have so many of the fish properties or state land that we do in this county. It's not farmable, so a lot of it was sold to the state. And so I want to briefly touch on what recharge of groundwater means and how it happens. So the recharge of groundwater, it happens in the spring in these wetlands. And so if you have healthy wetlands, the flow of water, it's slowed. And so the snow melt from the winter, it stays cold underground and it remains cold until it enters those cold water trout streams in the summer. This really, it helps maintain a healthy water temperature, specifically we're talking about a healthy water temperature in this case for trout. This cold water, it could also offset some of the warmer, maybe surface water runoff that's flowing into these streams. And so by slowing the flow of groundwater, these healthy wetlands, they not only increase the quality and quantity of groundwater, they also help with things like reducing erosion and flooding. And I'm going to kind of touch on those erosion and flooding a little bit more later here in the presentation, but thought it was a good point to bring up here. It's pretty important. Also, I should point out that here in Jackson County, there are a lot of systems that have mini tributaries that tend to contribute cold water and also provide spawning and nursery areas for these trout. And so now that we've kind of briefly talked about what makes Jackson County streams a little bit more resilient to climate change and kind of defined simply, I guess, what a healthy system is. I guess the next question to answer is what can we do to sort of to monitor these streams as climate continues to change, so we continue to be able to catch trout like we see in this picture. And so As as a fish biologist, the first thing that I think of when I think of monitoring is, of course, monitoring the fish populations. And so in this area, in my management unit, and it's different in different parts of the state, but we have our trend stations and rotation stations. So these stations are streams that are surveyed either annually or on a rotational basis, so possibly every 3, 6, or 12 years. And so these surveys, they help us to understand like the population dynamics. So we get information such as, relative abundance, which is catch per mile of trout, size structure, species distribution. So let's say if one of these surveys might show a significant change in maybe catch per mile, or maybe I notice a species shift from majority brook trout to brown trout. As a biologist, I can take some management actions that might benefit the trout. For example, I can make a regulation change or maybe do some supplemental stocking to benefit the stream's trout population. Another thing I want to touch on within this fish population monitoring is our ability as biologists to classify new trout streams. So we're able to survey streams that have the potential to hold trout. For example, these maybe smaller tributaries that aren't yet classified, but might have the ability or the potential to hold 2 to 3 year classes of trout. We can go and survey those and possibly classify them as trout streams. And this classification, it provides more protection to these streams in terms of permits and when in-stream work can be completed on them. Secondly, when I think of monitoring, the second thing that pops in my mind is monitoring the effects of beavers. And so this is another pretty controversial topic, and one that definitely has opinions on both sides of the spectrum. But it's currently being monitored and researched a little bit more extensively here within the DNR. So I know that the DNR fish research scientist, Matt Mitro, I'm sure you've all heard that name, but I know he is currently trying to, in his words, sort of fill in the gaps of this trout beaver interaction. So we know that trout and beavers, they've been interacting or coexisting for hundreds, thousands of years. Beavers come in and they create different habitat. So what does this mean? This poses some questions. Does it increase or decrease trout populations? What does it do to size structure, growth rates? Beavers, they play a pretty complex role in these cold water ecosystems. Some systems might benefit from having beavers, while others, they may only exhibit negative effects. So I guess at this point, it's still possible that we have more questions than answers. But I think that's pretty normal here in this like natural resources field. Sometimes we think we understand, we know something, but over time we might start to realize we don't know it all. We might not understand the entirety of the situation. So we have to keep asking these questions and also trying to answer them. I think that's what we're doing here in the DNR, and what Matt Mitro is doing in the research side is trying to do some new research by experimentally maybe manipulating these beaver populations on specific study streams. But me as a biologist, I have to be vigilant and monitor the trout populations and the trout and beaver interactions in the streams that I manage, and maybe prioritize streams that could have benefits from beaver removals. So the third and fourth bullet points here, I'm kind of wanted to mention them together because they both kind of tie back to our annual stream surveys a little bit. So the third bullet point here I want to mention is making sure we monitor areas with greater groundwater withdrawals. So for example, areas with high capacity wells, and then also documenting fragmentation due to poorly placed culverts or improperly sized culverts. And then also conversely, making sure we monitor the effects of correctly replaced ones. And so when we do our annual surveys on these cold water trout streams, we're not just surveying the fish populations. You know, we're out there and we're also summarizing things like habitat availability, stream bank erosion, aquatic invertebrate life, and the fishability of the stream. And so as a biologist, I have to be out there and I have to make comments and understand that whether I think maybe a culvert or some sort of structure might impede fish movement. And then also maybe if a water is so shallow, there's a possibility of drying up. It could be due to high capacity wells in the area. So as biologists and also as anglers too, we need to make sure to monitor these changes as they might have negative effects to the trout populations. Lastly, here within the monitoring, I wanted to touch on this idea of watershed-wide changes. So whether that be implementation of these larger scale conservation practices, or maybe conversely, getting a better understanding of these large scale negative land use changes. And so this idea of a watershed-wide change, it really ties into sort of my final topic and question, and that is what precautions are needed to maintain resilience under the threat of global warming. And so I want to mention here this idea of supporting programs that help maintain water on the landscape longer. So whether that means grassed waterways, buffer areas, wetland protection or rehabilitation. I was talking with Jim the other day and he had mentioned this idea of kind of maybe changing our focus to start doing more work in the headwaters or these upper portions of the watershed and maybe down into the wetlands and floodplains. And that kind of got me thinking a little bit, and I did want to tie it into this talk tonight. You know, kind of all this stuff that I've talked about, it's really related. So if you remember one thing or have one takeaway from the talk tonight, I'd like you to maybe remember that, you know, if we want to continue to have all the angling opportunities that we do now, we have to start thinking about more than just the fish. And sometimes that's difficult. You know, we get invested in things like numbers and size of fish that, you know, we forget that without the basis of a healthy system, we wouldn't have all the trout that we do. We might not have all the angling opportunities that we do. And so for this last part of my talk, I kind of wanted to instill this idea of that we need to start thinking about the bigger picture, maybe taking this sort of watershed wide approach. Because really what happens in the land surrounding these headwaters in these upper portions of the watershed, it really affects the quality of rivers and streams that are downstream, miles away downstream. And so in my first few slides, I mentioned quality and the quantity of groundwater. And so Jackson County might be pretty well off right now with relatively healthy wetlands that tend to slow the flow of water and reduce erosion and flooding. But if you look at, for example, the city of Arcadia down in southern part of Trempealeau County in that Trempealeau River watershed, they've been struggling with flooding for a long time. And Turton Creek down there has very, very heavy erosion and large flooding events. So I've recently learned that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has kind of stepped in down there and they've done some hydrological modeling and they're trying to evaluate the possibility of reducing flooding by improving land management, specifically looking at improving water infiltration and retention. And so this really, it has everything to do with what I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the quality and quantity of groundwater. Because by improving water infiltration, the groundwater is cleaner, more free of contaminants. And by improving retention, water is kept on the landscape longer. And so with this threat of global warming, climate change, like I said, we can't just think about fish populations and size structure in one stream. We need to maybe change our focus and start thinking about this bigger picture, or this sort of watershed wide approach. And like I said, that's not always easy. But maybe if we start to sort of think historically about how the landscape functioned, and think about what actions we can take now, that will hopefully allow the fisheries and other wildlife to endure and thrive long into the future, and we'll be able to have those angling opportunities long into the future. So with that, I hope I didn't confuse you any more than you maybe already were, but I can take any questions.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Emma. We sure appreciate it. And maybe what we'll do is, Kasey is on as well, but maybe what we'll do is we'll take a couple questions for Emma, and then we'll jump over to Kasey to present in just a couple minutes. But why don't we take, and if people have questions, probably the best way is just to put it in the chat. If you want to try to unmute yourself, we just don't want to get too many people talking at once. But let's open it up if anybody has a question for Emma.
Emma, this is Jim. I wanted to explain to the rest of the people who are not DNR folks that if there's a watershed issue or stream issue that's in your counties, you are our contact. That's correct. I mean, that is correct. We come see you first, and then we go to work with that. So if anyone has an issue or they see something, you are our person to go for. The issue that we're starting to look on watersheds, should we be looking at the whole picture? I mean, it's really difficult getting everyone all together, but is there an emphasis that the DNR and the wetland portions of DNR, are those philosophies changing or not?
I think they should be if they're not. We do.
Be careful, your boss is on there too.
I know that. I see him. But yeah, I mean, climate is changing, and there's global warming, and so we need to take action now. Part of natural resources is working together to, preserve what we have and give it to our future children and down the line. So yeah.
Okay, so there's some other questions here, but I have one more. Would it behoove us as a chapter to sit down with you in the next for the next couple of years and look at the potential streams we should work on? Should we be looking at Jackson County because it is more resilient, or do we need to look into Trempealeau and Buffalo to prop them up?
I mean, there's a lot of options here in Jackson County, but I think also Trempealeau County and Buffalo County have a lot of opportunities as well. And that's something that I can look into a little more, and we can have more in-depth conversations later too, if we want to focus on specific parts of my management area.
Oh, okay. I'll let it. There is one other thing. I saw that the north branch of the Trempealeau River is a class 1. And when I asked you about the Buffalo River, you kind of steered me towards the Trempealeau. So is that something in Jackson we should be looking at?
Yeah, so we've done work on, I know Dan in the past and Eric have done work on the north branch of the Trempealeau. So there's opportunities there for sure. And I just fish wise, the Trempealeau River system is a little bit better. But like I said, we do have opportunities on the Buffalo River systems too. There's some areas on the the South Fork and the North Fork that could be opportunities. And I don't know if I sent you those maps or not.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I can.
You've confused me completely on all of
Yeah,
it.
sorry.
I'm going to let you, you get this straightened out, but you do have some other questions, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you. Thank you.
So
Okay.
Emma, there's two questions in both the people. Maybe we'll start with Matt, your question, if you want to jump on, if you've got audio, Matt. But Matt asked about grasses and said reed canary grass is an invasive menace, but does a good job of stabilizing banks and probably holding water too. Are we just stuck with RC with the reed canary grass as our stream side grass? And do you have any thoughts on that? And Matt is the one who organizes all of our stream restoration projects. So wondering if you could talk on that.
Well, I'll be honest, so this might be more of a question for maybe Mike Leonard or something, but I don't have much experience doing like habitat restoration work. But I know there's got to be other, there's other grasses that we can definitely plant in that stream, that isn't reed canary that can buffer that area.
Okay. Matt, any follow-up questions on that at all?
Yeah, I think that, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, my question is that, without a full scale habitat improvement project, if we're just clearing banks like we do in a lot of our brushing work days, reed canary grass is the only thing that's going to come back. You really don't have a choice.
Yeah.
That's what we get back. So, should we, how should we feel about that? Should we feel like, well, this is what we got, or how good of a job does RC do in what you're talking about here?
Well, it does buffer the waterway and provide protection from erosion and runoff. So it does the job.
Yeah, good question. Next question, and maybe we'll take Peter, we'll take your question next, and then maybe we'll jump over to you, Kasey, if you think you're ready to present. If you want to just shoot me a message or something. But
Yes.
Peter, okay, perfect, Kasey, thanks. Peter, if you would go ahead and just we'll finish up this question. You've got a good question in the text, so maybe you can just ask Emma directly.
Sure. Hi, Emma.
Hi.
I'm hoping that you could provide just a bit more detail of what a watershed approach focusing on the upper reaches
Yes.
kind of look like. And particularly, I was at the Driftless Symposium, I guess it was last winter, and I was really struck by the emphasis on soil percolation and how big a factor that is, and also just wondering about the phosphorus credit program, how that might relate to it. So I'm excited about the watershed approach. So I'm just wondering if you can give us a little more of a picture to grasp a hold of.
Yeah, and I think that this is, it's definitely something that I'm learning too. I haven't even been here a year yet, so this is definitely a lot of new stuff for me. And so I hope that we can work together in the future on this. But basically, my idea is that, and I was talking with Jim about this too, is this idea of maybe looking into because basically what happens in the upper watersheds affects these middle and lower portions of the watershed too. So maybe looking at more headwater stream work, making sure we protect those streams in those areas, because if we reduce, if we increase the quality and the quantity of groundwater up in those areas, it affects positively, hopefully, everything that happens downstream from there. So, and like I said, this is something that I'm still learning a lot too. So I'm hoping that I can learn a lot more over the course of these couple of years, and we can work together and then do some good for this area.
And then I do have a just the fish question.
Yep.
Which, okay, I fish a small tributary in Buffalo County, and I hope this situation is applicable to a lot of us here. It has a quite a healthy brook trout population, like a zillion little ones, and some medium-sized brook trout that have a little heft to them. It also has some brown trout that migrate from the stream it flows into that is stocked. So my friend Duke Welter was like, you know, eat every brown trout you catch. So I did harvest some brown trout, which I was happy to do. But then I got to thinking a little more about it, and I thought, I'm torn by the intersection of two things. One is, you know, okay, those brown trout they can just take over a stream. You know, they do seem to be kind of like buckthorn. Once they're in, they are hard to eradicate. But then I also think those brook trout can also overpopulate so easily. Maybe they are serving a useful function by, you know, their predatory function. So I got totally and you know, I just got totally confused about how to approach this little stream in terms of what kind of harvest to do.
Yeah, you know, I mean, if you want to keep the brown trout, you know, keep the brown trout if that's what you want to do. But that's a hard question, and it's definitely. I'm sure you've thought about it for a long time, but I mean, yes, those brown trout typically and not in all streams, but in a lot of streams, they will tend to outcompete brook trout. And that's not to say that happens in every stream. But yeah, I mean, they could be helping, you know, they could be eating these smaller brook trout and maybe helping the size structure in that smaller tributary. But, you know, if you want to keep the brown trout, keep the trout. If you don't, that's okay too.
Sure. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Peter. And Peter's going to put the GPS coordinates of his secret stream in the chat function. So, all right. Well, let's kind of along those lines of the whole brook trout, brown trout. Let's go ahead and slide over to Kasey Yallaly, who's on with us as well. She's also a Wisconsin DNR Fisheries Biologist and has done a lot of work in West Central Wisconsin and beyond on brook trout populations and brown trout. And so Kasey's going to talk to us a little bit about Brook Trout Reserve and some other aspects of the fishery. So if it's okay with you, Kasey, we'll turn it over to you, and then we can take some questions at the end of your presentation.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good.
Great.
Can everybody hear me okay?
We can, yes.
Okay, awesome. I'm so sorry for being late. I was having some major technical difficulties, but hopefully I can get this up and running.
It was no problem when we were doing other things anyway, Kasey, and now we can see you in presentation mode, so it looks great.
Good. Awesome. Sounds good. So my talk is going to tie in very much to what Emma was talking about. You'll kind of see that as we go along. But I'm going to talk about the Wisconsin DNR's Brook Trout Reserves program. So basically talk about the future brook trout habitat losses that we're predicting and some of our management strategies to try to combat this moving forward. I'm also going to touch on a little bit of our genetics work that some folks at Stevens Point have been doing across the state. I'm going to focus just on my area. If you guys know me, I do manage Western Dunn County and then Pierce and St. Croix County as well. So as you all know, trout are very very easily influenced by stream temperatures. Brook trout in particular require colder water temperatures than a lot of other trout species. Their upper thermal limit is about 75 degrees. That's not saying they can tolerate this, but not for a long period of time. Brown trout are a little more tolerant of warmer water temperatures, as we all know. They can tolerate a little bit, poorer water quality. They're just a little bit more resilient than brook trout are. So our brook trout reserves program, there is a team of folks that were brought together in the fisheries management program. And some of these slides are from them. And this is what brook trout reserves basically are in a nutshell. So they are a selection of some of the places in Wisconsin where brook trout have the best chance of enduring the effects of climate change and other environmental perturbations. So these designations of reserves enables us, the DNR, and its partners, which are you guys, to focus their specific tools to ensure that brook trout remain viable in the state going into the future. So this is our goal within fisheries management. Basically, we want to establish and manage these brook trout reserves in Wisconsin to support them biologically, environmentally, and climatologically resilient self-sustaining populations to preserve our quality fishing opportunities and conservation of genetic diversity. So I'm going to jump right into it. This was taken from our team that has developed these brook trout reserves. They're still in the process of establishing these reserves, but I'm going to talk about the ones that we are focusing on currently. So this, the state is divided into the 4 main regions. And you can see on this graph here, this is going to tell you basically what models are predicting. I'm going to talk a little bit about how these models work, which models we used, and it's not just modeling, it's using hard data too. So a lot of our data that me and Emma and other biologists collect goes into these predictions and how we choose brook trout reserve streams. So as you all know, we're in the kind of the upper part of the driftless area. The driftless area has a major problem, and I'm going to focus on that going forward. Going into the future, it's going to be one of the regions that gets hit a little harder in terms of temperature, in stream temperatures going into mid-century. So you can see habitat loss that's predicted for brook trout by mid-century is about 75%. So we're going to lose about 75% of our brook trout habitat. That's likely. The northern lakes and forest regions, you can see it fares a little better. It's gonna lose about half of its current brook trout habitat. It's really just a difference between the land use. So the northern lakes and forests, it's obviously heavily forested. The land use is much different. The groundwater is different. Everything's a little bit different. So the driftless area is going to get hit a little bit harder for brook trout habitat than some of the other areas going into the future. This is a really interesting graph here. So this is projected trout stream temperature increases going into mid-century, so 2046 to 2065. The different colors on this map tell you about how much the stream temperature is going to change going into the future. So the red streams are where temperatures are going to increase the most going into mid-century, and the blue streams are going to fare a little bit better. They're not going to have as much of a temperature increase as the rest of them. So you can look across this map up here in the northern part. So this is Dunn County. I just manage the western half. So most of those streams are looking pretty good. There's not going to be a huge temperature increase, but there is going to be some. So this would be like the Wilson Creek, Gilbert Creek watersheds, Knights Creek, South Fork of the Hay. Those are all faring pretty well, especially compared to some of the other streams that you can see just to the east and then further down south too. So that is encouraging. We do have very good connection to groundwater in this area, which kind of shows up in this map. That west slope of the Red Cedar watershed is likely going to do better than some of the other streams. So this is another map. This is just the climate effects on future brook trout distribution. So this dictates whether brook trout are likely to be lost, or are they going to be at risk, or are they going to remain a stable population going into the future. So you can see red is lost. There's a lot of red across the graph, and there's very little black. Kind of in the middle driftless region, some of those populations are likely to remain a little more stable. You can see there's some little black specks in western Dunn County. The Wilson and the Gilbert Creek watershed have some of those. So they're likely to remain stable in parts of the stream, but there's a lot of at-risk sections of the streams as well too, where maybe we can take some management action to try to combat this loss. So this graph kind of breaks that down a little bit more. It's pretty sobering. There's a lot of red on the graph. The red represents lost brook trout. So this is total stream length in miles. And then you've got all of the regions of the driftless area on the bottom of the graph. So you can see the Kinnickinnic is in my area, as well as the Chippewa River region, which is part of your guys' area as well. There's a lot that's predicted to be lost brook trout habitat, but you can see there's still some areas that are likely to remain stable, and some at-risk populations as well. But overall, I mean, it's not fun to think about, and there's a lot at stake here. And then I'm just going to get into a little bit. I'm kind of going to zoom through this. I know I don't want to take up too much of the time with this, but I'm just going to mention what goes into determining these brook trout reserve streams. So USGS has what's called FishViz. It's available to everyone. It's online. Everybody can go look at it. And it has the entire state of Wisconsin and Minnesota and some other states, and you can kind of play around with it. It even like breaks out the different species. You can look at smallmouth habitat, brook trout, brown trout habitat, and you can look at stream temperatures as well. So it's a really good tool, and you guys can play around with it too, but that's part of the data that goes into determining brook trout reserves and this modeling of stream temperature changes. So basically with the brook trout reserves program, the main objectives with this in fisheries management with the DNR is first to identify and establish these reserves. Second, for each reserve, assess biological, environmental, and climate threats. And then collaborate with partners like TU to identify and implement some conservation actions. And then continue monitoring the status and the trends of brook trout populations, which we continuously do, like Emma mentioned, with our annual sampling. So these data sources are what goes into it. I just mentioned FishViz, that gives us our stream temperatures and brook trout occurrence. Fishtail, so this is anthropogenic stressors on stream fish populations. So this takes into account everything that, urbanization and other agricultural impacts on fisheries populations and streams. Our fish and habitat database, this is our internal DNR habitat database where we collect all our data and we enter all that in. So all of that data is taken into account. And then we also have a DNR managed lands application. This gives acquisition project boundaries. It identifies public lands and private lands, as well as trout stream classification. So that's all taken into account when we're determining these brook trout reserves. And also Wisconsin Land 2, which gives you the land cover of each watershed. So these data sources, basically what they give us is the amount of existing brook trout habitat, the projected future brook trout habitat, connectivity to other waters, so focusing on the whole watershed. So if the main stem of the watershed is getting warmer, can those fish retreat to some colder headwater areas? Also, the presence of brown trout is taken into account with these brook trout reserve streams. That's definitely a factor. Groundwater inputs and changes, those are super important. A lot of that is changing right now and for the better. Groundwater is actually getting a little better in my area, as well as some other areas around the state. Amount, distribution, and type of public land. So that matters a lot. In terms of management, I'll talk a little bit about that coming up here. Also, the geographic region, like I said earlier, how the driftless area is so different than the northern lakes and forests, and also land use. So here right now, this map shows you the 54 brook trout reserves that have so far been identified in the state. You can see that each one has, there's different colors, and those represent some different categories that these streams have been put into. So you can see in my area, Western Dunn County, there's the orange blob, that's the South Fork of the Hay watershed. That's listed as vulnerable, where there's a rehabilitation opportunity. And then like the Wilson Creek and the Gilbert Creek watershed, it's in that olive green. So that's in the category of environmentally resilient, and our management action is to secure habitat there. So that's just an example of how we've kind of categorized these different reserves. So once we've identified these reserves, we can kind of focus our management actions onto these streams. Some of the things that we can do, myself and Emma and other biologists, we can focus on changing angling regulations to try to protect brook trout more if they're declining or predicted to decline into the future. We can do stocking. In-stream habitat improvement is really important. Beaver control, Emma mentioned that. Stream fragmentation improvement, culverts and dams, fish passage, land acquisition, riparian vegetation management. That's what you guys help out with a lot too, with your work days, groundwater protection, and public outreach. So I'm going to try to zoom through these real quick, but these are just some of the brook trout reserves in my area. This one is in white. This is Katy Creek. This one's listed as thermally resilient. Average future brook trout habitat, but it is a resilient population. This is just kind of how we've categorized these different streams. So here you can see Katy and the Wilson and Gilbert Creek watersheds. These are all brook trout reserve streams in my area. South Fork of the Kinnickinnic River is also a brook trout reserve. And then here we've got Pine Creek. It's that little orange dot. It's highlighting all of these orange ones. They're kind of grouped together in this private ag sub-watershed that's also got some public riparian areas. So Pine Creek is listed in this category. Plum, Rush, and Pine Creek, those are all grouped together as a brook trout reserve. And then these are kind of all of the West Slope, the Red Cedar, and Plum and Pine grouped together. These are thermally resilient, but they might have some weaker brook trout habitat. The species resilience is below average going into the future. And I just wanted to touch on a little bit about our genetic sampling throughout the state. This is really cool, and it ties in to our management of these populations. So you can see I've got the brook trout reserves on the left-hand side of the screen, and then our genetic sampling that we've done so far throughout the state. There's been a little more data points added to this here recently. I don't have those yet, but you can see basically biologists throughout the state have collected genetic samples. We sent those into Stevens Point. They've analyzed those basically to determine whether populations have been influenced by hatchery genetics or whether these populations are basically Wisconsin wild brook trout, and have not had a lot of influence from hatchery genetics. So you can see here the native populations are those that are the wild Wisconsin strain of brook trout. Those are all the red dots. So in my area, there is Katy Creek, Knights Creek, North Branch of Gilbert Creek, as well as Upper Pine Creek. So those are all native, which is pretty cool. Wilson Creek has since been determined as a native as well. So that can kind of steer us more towards how we want to manage those streams, and kind of dictate our priorities when it comes to management. The non-native streams in my area, I don't have many that have been analyzed yet, but South Fork of the Kinnickinnic is one that is not native. So it's been influenced by hatchery genetics to the point where we don't consider it wild Wisconsin strain brook trout anymore. And these are just kind of all of those streams grouped together, all of the brook trout reserve streams in my area. So I mentioned earlier, what can we do, to try to combat this going forward as management actions? And I know I went through those really quickly, but those are grouped into different categories. So we can focus different management actions on the different streams based on what we think they need, and why we've grouped them into those different categories. So some streams we might just want to acquire easements and protect them. Other streams we might want to do a lot of habitat work because the populations need a lot of help. The habitat is really degraded. So land acquisition, stocking, regulation changes, species management, that brook versus brown, just because brown trout do outcompete brook trout in a lot of situations. In some streams they don't, but in a lot they do. Habitat restoration, as well as our riparian management practices. And I'm almost done here. In some cases, it does look like we are going to have to cut our losses in terms of brook trout loss. Brown trout, I mentioned earlier, and you guys all probably know they're a little more resilient. They can handle warmer water temperatures. And here is a graph that shows our stable predicted brown trout, our risk brown trout, and our lost brown trout by mid-century. So we're not predicted to lose a lot of brown trout habitat, which is really interesting. The browns are likely still going to be able to handle what's thrown at them by mid-century. We are going to lose a few, but some streams are just going to get too warm for brook trout. Some streams we do have the opportunity to manage those and hopefully combat that, and hopefully give brook trout a chance to hang on. So that's kind of how we can dictate our management actions to try to help them out. And with that, I will take any questions that you guys have.
All right, fantastic, Kasey. Thank you very much for, it's a lot to think about and digest here. So let's do the same thing. Let's open up the floor to questions. If you have questions, put them in the chat, or if you want to jump on with your microphone, as long as we're not people talking over each other, we'll go ahead and open things up for questions. I'll go ahead and just jump in while others are thinking about them. In terms of, Kasey, managing when you have native versus non-native brook trout, I guess twofold question. One, how does that, do you prioritize managing native? And secondly, do the non-native tend to have a more robust or adaptability to these conditions than the native, or vice versa?
In some situations, that's kind of an unknown. I know, for example, Pine Creek, way down in southern Pierce County, that population, there's a part of the stream that goes underground, and there's an upper population that has been so disconnected from the rest of the brook trout population. That population has genetically diverged so much that they can't really put it in wild or the not wild, just because it's so much different. So there might be populations that stand out like that going into mid-century that they might be much more stable than other populations. So it's really hard to say whether the hatchery versus wild strain, how they're going to react. But I would say in my area, we focus a lot of the stocking on the wild strain. So we use South Fork the Hay genetics to stock streams around my area. And that's the wild strain of a fish. So I'm not really stocking any of like the hatchery strain anymore, I guess. But yes, I am prioritizing, wild populations. If I have a chance to work on a stream where, 2 streams are degraded and one's got wild, genetically wild brook trout, I'm probably going to prioritize that higher than the stream that doesn't, just because, if that stream does get a little degraded, the population starts to drop, I can stock on top of those, and it's not going to really degrade the genetics as much as it might if I'm stocking on top of a truly wild population, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, other questions people have?
Hey, Kasey and Emma.
Yes.
When I asked you to do this, I was really excited, but I didn't expect you to make me depressed after hearing about all this information.
I
So,
know.
but I did see this at the state chapter a couple of years ago. So, watersheds is, let's say Wilson Creek and the Trempealeau, North Fork, the Trempealeau. How is a chapter like TU, just being a small partner, how are we going to approach this to help solve this? So when you two are my age, it's actually, you can still go fish there. So what's the approach going to be here in the next few years to solve some of these problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a hard one. And I was kind of talking about this the other day, after I heard that you guys are interested in, working in the headwaters and doing more, conservation practices like with wetlands and incorporating all of that. And I think, at TU, something that you guys could do, to help out, we have an easement program and NRCS, they have all of this funding, try to, I do as much as I can, like knocking on doors, and I attend meetings to try to get landowners like on board, whether they sign up for an easement or not. I'd love for them to sign up for an easement, but if they don't, it's totally fine as long as they do something. So I think maybe, working with landowner outreach and try to get them on board, and maybe, this government, if people are scared of working with government or signing up for something with the government, maybe TU can try to maybe like open that door with them, and maybe, they will listen to TU a little bit more than they would to, a government agency or something. So that might be something to try to get them on board. Because I know there's, Wilson Creek, for example, I've did a lot of outreach and we've gotten a lot of easements recently, but there's just some that, I can't reach out to. And maybe that could be where TU maybe steps in and, tries to get something rolling.
Okay, so then, but these projects are extremely large and they're going to be time consuming, and you're the local, you only have Nate, okay?
I know. I only have Nate.
Yeah. And Emma's got Mike. So is there other avenues that we should start looking at? Because this is a huge, I mean, I'm 72 and I'm really don't want to wait for 25 years for you to make this work, which you're going to have to put me in a wheelchair or a walker, or both of you have to carry me out here. So what other avenues should we be looking at functional wise for habitat work?
Yeah, it's tough because, like you said, we've only got the one crew in my area. Emma's got one crew in her area that also does lacrosse. So, whether whether it be private contractors working on, easements or private landowners, just getting that cost share is a tough one. But, you know, with the easements, say one landowner signs up or two, but the two around those might not. And it's really hard with these watersheds that are so, composed of private ownership. It's just really tough. And I don't know if there's another avenue to come at it, working with farmers. Maybe there's like small local groups that can be targeted, to try to outreach to them, and try to get them on board. But it's so hard when the land is so split up, to try to get everyone on board and really focus on the whole watershed. That's what I'm trying to do with Katy Creek. Like, I can't just look at Katy Creek and try to restore the brook trout population. I've also got to look at the Yallaly, which the Katy is a trib to. So I've got to look at that whole area to try to really get something done. So it's going to be really tough. And I guess I don't have like a great answer for you. What we can do more, I guess, always look at trying to reach out to the landowners, because they're the ones that have the land, that these streams run through. It's just tough.
Okay, Dick Duplessis has a question there, Tom, and so does. So I'm going to get off of this, but thanks, Kasey and Emma.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. I'm glad what you did. I knew I kind of threw you when I asked you to come at this way and not give us all reports on how many. Well, the problem, I didn't want you to tell me how many brook trout was in Wilson Creek when I go there and I can't catch one. It just drives me crazy. So we'll go from there. So we'll talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, for sure.
Dick, you want to go ahead, and then we'll go Dick and then Damien and then Dale. So Dick, you're on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, great. Kasey, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, for sure.
Peter had a question earlier that I think applies to Katy Creek also. You have an issue in that creek with brown trout.
Yes.
How do we address those questions for streams like Katy, where you're trying to rehabilitate and improve the brook trout populations, but you have a brown trout problem?
Yeah. So I've got multiple streams in my area that brown trout have invaded, and they've never invaded before. Katy Creek, there wasn't a brown detected in there before the year 2000. And then they started moving in. And I think I've came up with the reason or reasons why. But every stream is so different. Like, for example, Pine Creek, the same thing happened in there, but it was a little too far gone by the time anyone thought to take any management actions or had the chance to take a management action. But Katy Creek was kind of still at the point where I feel that I could do something, and I'm still working. We're still working on that. That's going to be an ongoing thing. It's really hard. It kind of depends, I guess, if Katy, the length of the stream, the size of the stream, what is the ratio of brooks to browns? Has that changed? Some streams, both species occur, and they've always coexisted. Maybe brook trout at a little bit lower level, but that ratio of brooks to browns hasn't changed a lot. But in Katy and Pine Creek and a couple of my other smaller streams, it's totally flipped, like within a decade. So it's a dramatic change. Why do some streams flip and why others don't? So with Katy, I'm taking pretty drastic management actions in there. I started a brown trout removal program or project in 2018. We're continuing that. We removed the most browns, well, not the most browns. We removed browns out of the most miles of stream in Katy this year than we have before. So it was really good, and it was really encouraging. There were less browns. The size structure has really declined. So that means we're kind of cropping them off. Also, I mentioned looking at the whole watershed. So I've totally changed the stocking regime in the Yallaly River. So I'm no longer stocking browns, and I'm stocking native brook trout. So hopefully, I really foresee the Yallaly and Katy Creek as, you know, pretty hardcore brook trout streams going into the future, when the Yallaly has always been this stocked brown trout fishery. So we'll see how it goes going forward. But judging by some of our monitoring that we've had, it's really encouraging. And I think it's going to turn out pretty good if we keep a handle on it, and we continue to do what we're doing. But in different streams, it's hard. It may be impossible. I've worked in the South with silver carp that are highly invasive, and they're moving up here. So I know what I know what it takes, and I know in a lot of situations it's impossible, to totally eradicate a species. But I feel in some streams like Katy, it's possible. In some other streams, it might be too. There might be some different, make a barrier and do removal, or, stock a certain strain, or, change the stocking regime. Those could all be things that help out with that, or maybe are the thing that changes it.
Thanks.
All right,
Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Dick. Let's go to Damien. Damien, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks you guys, Emma and Kasey, for your presentation. Either one of you, or Kasey, I guess you're on the mic now. Do you have any research, or what does tiger trout indicate in a stream, especially if there's larger numbers? Have you researched anything like that, or is it just a phenomenon, or what?
I haven't researched it much, and maybe Emma has, maybe she knows more. But yeah, we pick up the occasional tiger trout in a few of my streams too. Plum Creek is one where we usually get a few. Lost Creek, which is a trib to the Rush River, we get a few. But it's just a hybrid of the brook and the brown. And they don't occur very often. I haven't seen many larger ones, so I don't know. I have, I know they make it to larger sizes, but not very often. But, maybe, I don't know, I haven't did a lot of research on it, but there might be, they might not be as vigorous because they're a hybrid as, just the plain brook or the plain brown. But maybe Emma knows more about that. But I pick them up occasionally in some of my streams. But yeah, it's just the hybrid between the two species.
It is correct that they don't reproduce, right?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
Okay.
cannot. That's one of their limitations as a hybrid. Yep.
Emma, did you have anything to add there? I saw your mic go off for a minute.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, I similar to Kasey, we just catch a few every year, not even every year. And so, yeah, they're just a hybrid of the two.
Okay, thanks. Dale, let's go to you. Question that you have.
I just want to thank both of you for the overtime tonight and sharing your ideas with us and the work that you're doing. And I also wanted to say what a good idea I think that was for all of us that are listening and watching to reach out. That's something that we can do as a gap between the DNR and the landowner, and reach out to them. And some of them we've gotten to know really well, and kind of put our Duke Welter hat on and go and stop and talk to those people. He never goes by any farmer on a trout stream without getting to know them. And my question is for both of you, or maybe for your boss who's listening, is there any hope in the future? What's the future look like in terms of more restoration teams? Do you have any inkling about that?
I don't know if Heath wants to jump on. But yeah, I don't know about adding more crews. I don't know if that's a possibility into the future. I definitely know I've got enough work to keep them busy, but I don't know if it's in the funding cards to get another crew going. I don't know if Heath's going to jump on or not, but that's my 2 cents.
Hey, can you guys hear me? This is Heath.
Oh, there he is.
We can.
So right now we do have some vacancies, and Dan Yallaly will be hiring hopefully some, we call them habitat technicians.
Yeah.
in the near future. So there'll be one in the Eau Claire crew and one on the La Crosse crew. So if and when, right now the state's in a hiring freeze. So if and when that hiring freeze is lifted in the future, we're hoping to get those positions hired. So I can't give you a timeline right now, but that would be two more full-time employees working, one up in the Eau Claire area and one in the La Crosse area. So that's good news. At least we'll have more staff doing that work in the future, hopefully.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome.
That's great. Okay, other questions for either Emma or Kasey people have?
I did want to mention, I know when I normally present at your guys' meetings, I bring my spreadsheet full of fish numbers for each stream. And since we're not meeting in person, I can definitely send that to anyone. Although because of COVID, we only got to sample very small streams this year. So those headwater streams, which is really cool because those streams don't get a lot of attention. So we did sample some very small streams that we don't normally. So if you guys have any questions about those, let me know. I'm sure Emma was probably in the same boat.
Yep, yeah, I have all the data, so, you know, just feel free to shoot me an email and I can send that off to you if you're interested.
Great.
Hey, Emma and Kasey, can you send that to me as a PDF and I'll just post it onto our website? Is that kosher?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
It might take me, it'll take me a little bit to get it together, but yes, I can do that.
Okay, you got 4 or 5 minutes. Is that?
Okay.
No.
I'll type fast.
Yeah, just send it to me whenever you can, and then I'll just put it on. It'll make it much easier for the guys to look at it.
Okay. Cool.
All right.
And we got a couple messages just in the individual chats too about some of the data that you've presented, that you both have presented, and how it has some power. And even though a lot of us know about some of it, seeing the numbers and seeing how it's conveyed certainly has an impact. And even talking about things like trout in the classroom, and you know how that may impact both, you know, educators as well as students and so on. Kasey, is there any, should we email you if we were maybe going to use a slide or something like that we might be able to put on our webpage or post or something like that? Should we just email you to make sure it's okay to put that up?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Okay.
It should be no problem. But yeah, like I said, I did pull some of the slides from the Brook Trout Reserves team. So if you do, I'll just like ask them just to make sure
Absolutely.
it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Excellent content. Okay. Last call. Any questions before we wind down the formal part of the meeting tonight? Okay. Well, I think we want to reiterate what Dale and Jim and Dick and Damien have all said, that certainly we appreciate both of you, not just coming on for tonight, but also for all the work that you're doing behind the scenes and in front of the scenes and in the current kind of climate on multiple levels. We appreciate all you're doing and the dedication you have. And, you know, we sure hope to continue active partnership with the broader perspective too of the watershed and the fisheries as well. So thank you both for being on. We sure appreciate it. I think for the rest of the time, you know, I think we're probably going to shut down the formal part. I don't think we have anything more important to discuss. We've got our next meeting, like Jim said, in February. Hunter Dorn will be on doing a fly tying, and we'll have the materials on the website that you can have with you to tie. Got some stream projects. I don't know, Matt, you're on it, not to put you on the spot, but is there another date set for a stream project?
Looking at the last weekend of January, and I'll get the notice out there.
Yeah, so Matt's had some good things going. We got limited participants because of COVID, but make sure to take a look at that. We'll put this meeting up on our YouTube channel, as well as the past meetings that certainly have great content as well. I think other than that, if people want to stick around and just chat or shoot the bull or whatever, you're certainly welcome to. Kasey and Emma, though, we'll let you guys go. It's been a long day for you. So once again, on behalf of the chapter and all of us here, we certainly appreciate it. Lots of messages of appreciation to you both. So thank you for all of your time.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah,
No problem. Thank you.
great to be on. So if the rest of you want to hang out in here, you certainly can and shoot the breeze. But we'll, I think, shut it down. Jim, anything else from your end?
No, I'm pretty good. I'm just really appreciate the Emma and Kasey coming up and showing these, the issues of climate change. And I think I've had this idea about watersheds and headwaters that Tracy from the Wisconsin Wetlands Association kind of planted the seed here about a year or so ago. And I think there's a number of those things that we should look at, and hopefully we go forward with it. And it's not as sexy as talking about a bunch how many trout you caught, but if we don't do it, there won't be, you'll be talking about how many suckers or smallmouth you caught. So we'll go from there.
Yep. Sounds great. Well, thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. Have a good rest of the night, and we'll see you next month.
Good night, everybody.